Welcome, everybody. Hello, this is Jeff Schechter, aka Shecky, with my good buddy and business partner, Mr. Jack Gibson. Hello, Jack.
Hey, Shecky. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
Yeah, welcome to the High Return Real Estate Show. We have got actually just an amazing podcast. I know, Jack, we talked about this. It's like this was kind of the podcast we had to do. And it's just based on seeing so many investors just do things either too much or not enough or kind of right or not right enough. And it's really all about analyzing a deal. And so the title of this podcast is Analysis or Paralysis, when to analyze and when to act. So today is the day what we are going to dispel every single myth that is out there regarding the proper analysis of a property. So stay tuned. You're in for a big treat on this show. Welcome to the High Return Real Estate Show, the podcast for heavy hitters. 2 men, 1 mission. It's time to build your empire. Welcome back, everybody. This is Shecky at the High Return Real Estate Show. And right now we're going to dive into it and cover all of the basics that every investor should watch for. Now, granted, please understand that we are typically in the buy and hold world, so this is going to be mostly geared towards buy and hold investors, but we're going to look at all the different items that you should be analyzing when you look at a buy and hold property. So let's talk about the first one. Obviously, Jack, the first one is price. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Shecky, one thing obviously that you've got to look at when you're analyzing a property is the price comparative to, other prices of comparable properties in the marketplace. So in other words, one of the most costly mistakes that new investors make, actually, I definitely can say this from personal experience and then also just from being in the real estate, game for, a few years. The number one mistake that new investors make is they pay too much for a property. And so that's all, you can definitely head this off, and it doesn't have to take you months of analyzation, is looking at, the property that, for example, that you've got your eyes on, and then look around at, other properties and see what they're priced at. Now, one challenge too, Shecky, that people have, and especially investors in our, arena have got to understand is that off-market properties are sometimes really hard to find, like what are they actually selling for? So that it's not always just going on the MLS and looking at MLS type properties, because you and I both know those don't always accurately project the true values in a particular marketplace. For example, in Indianapolis, the bulk of properties are sold off-market. Most of the properties going off the MLS, a lot of them, I shouldn't say most, but there's a chunk that are going off the MLS that, they're dilapidated. They need quite a bit of work. So comparing that to a freshly rehabbed, rent-ready, single or duplex could definitely be a huge mistake. But at the end of the day, if you're buying, at or below market value, of course, preferably, right, under market value, then you're putting yourself in a position to where you have a little bit of equity or maybe a lot of equity in the property. And you also have an easy exit strategy, just in case something comes up. Now, the big key with buy and hold, guys, is that when you get into buy and hold, you've got to be, the mindset and the plan is you're sticking with that property for years and even, going to give it to your kids, right? Will it to your children and your grandchildren. And the costly mistake in buy and hold is if you buy a property and then you sell it within a year, you've got oftentimes you're probably in a rush. So Shecky, they got to drop the price to be able to sell it quick. So they can't really be patient. And then you're going to also have commission costs and closing costs that are going to take place to be able to move that property. So in all likelihood, you sell it really quick. I mean, properties just generally don't appreciate that fast to be able to make up for, those kinds of selling costs. So purchasing, a little bit under or a lot under market price is a really, really smart thing. And Shecky, one other thought here before we move on is I'm a huge fan of what we call forced appreciation. In other words, I love taking on projects that other people don't really want, sending in a rehab crew, being patient, waiting for the rehab crew to, to work their magic on the property, and bringing that property to a, rent ready, really presentable market condition. That's where I like to be in control, because then I can force the appreciation to happen much faster by doing, improvements on that property. So if our investors are really thinking like investors, with that investor mindset, they're going to want to take on a rehab project and take on repairs where they can force, equity. They force that appreciation to happen very fast versus buying it, at market price and then waiting over the, next several years for it to go up in value. So what are some other things, behind the numbers that are often overlooked to have to do with price?
Well, I wanted to just kind of thin slice something that you said, because you're using a term called market price, and that can be oftentimes a vague term, especially when we can compare that to, say, appraised price or appraised value. So a market value really means that that's what the market will bear. So, if anybody is selling a property anywhere, whether it's MLS, off market, or whatever, and the seller and the buyer come to an agreement on a number, there is a market for that property. That's the market price. It doesn't really matter what anybody else is paying. It's not necessarily the same thing as appraised value, because, you brought up a point about, properties, being, maybe near something that's boarded up, and, you were willing to take on the risk of doing all this rehab and waiting it out, and really building forced appreciation and value into the property. And oftentimes when you get an appraisal, that is not taken into consideration. There's just a lot of averages taken in. Right. So the point that I want to make here, and I know I'm kind of long-winded on this one, is that when we sell properties to investors or we buy them for ourselves, we're using a market value. And when I look at the market, for me, when I'm looking at my own properties personally, and I want to encourage other investors to kind of lean more in this direction, is to say, what is this price in relation to the rent? So is this thing in a condition versus its price to bring me a really, really great return? I don't, if I'm paying $65,000 for whatever property, I don't care if something's sold next door for $70,000 or $40,000. It's less of an issue to me as if I'm going to hold this property for a long time, how is it going to perform? So in my mind, what I look at in price, I look at it more against what the rents and the condition of the property is versus what other things are selling for around it. Because what other things sold for around my property have a lot less to do with how it will perform versus the conditions, the management, the rental of this property. And so I think that it's important for people not to get too hung up on all these things that are happening outside of this one particular property that you're looking at. And I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying it's one of those areas, especially appraised value, where investors can put way too much weight on that metric, and it ends up costing them a lot of money in that consideration.
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. And just to add something to that, because this is very important consideration, right? At the top of the list, right, of what we're talking about is price for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely, of course, we all know how important this is. So there is a big difference between appraised value and market value, as you're saying. Appraised value is an appraiser's view of what the value of that property is relative to other similar properties. Market value, as you said, Shecky, and summed it up really well, that's what the market says they're willing to pay. Yeah. So it's very interesting all the time. You and I have this conversation about, people wanting to do, financing and whatnot, especially in the C-class properties, where, I'll tell an investor, look, market value, appraised value are two different things. And market value says we have $800,000 in closings coming up in the next week probably 2 weeks. Okay. So the market's saying one thing, and then the appraiser might come in and say, well, these $800,000 worth of properties are the market's, appraised value is 700 or whatever. Maybe they'll say it's 900, not likely. So it's investors got to remember and got to take that into consideration, is that market value is to me, it's way more important, because that tells me how quickly and what price can I get when I go to sell my property.
Yeah, exactly. So good point, and thank you for that. Let's move on. Next one, obviously only two things certain in life: death and taxes.
Oh, gosh.
So we're not going to talk about death on this podcast, but let's talk about taxes. So what are your thoughts as far as what to look at when you're assessing taxes of a property?
Well, now that you put it in that grim perspective, all I can think about is tonight's Halloween,
Yeah.
And there's just going to be a lot of death floating around our neighborhood.
It's a good day to talk about that.
Right. But on the taxes front, the big thing, I think, obviously we want to be in areas where, the taxes are reasonable. You can get into certain states and regions of the country where taxes make it almost impossible to cash flow your property. And taxes alone, that one expense could eat up your entire, months of rent. So, And then along with that, you got insurance and vacancies and maintenance, repairs, CapEx, all that. So certainly we want to look at, making sure that are we investing in an area where taxes are reasonable? And then the other part is, are the assessments fair in relation to the price of the property? In other words, the property taxes are based on the assessed values. So what are those assessed values? Are they actually reasonable for where the property is? Shecky, we can certainly run into properties where wow, those taxes are way, way off the charts. This assessor must have been off the rocker, right? And so
what are you saying is that there's sometimes that governments make mistakes?
Well, what humans do, right? And humans run government. So I think that overall, I mean, they can be at a higher assessed value than what it really should be, but it also may not be a deal killer either. Those taxes could be higher, but then the cash flow is so strong that it overcompensates for that. So just something to look at, but you definitely want to be able to be in a position too, where if the taxes are pretty, high, that you could dispute those and, try to get them down. I don't think that's the easiest thing in the world to do, but that is certainly a possibility. I've heard of, investors' stories of people being able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the issue that you bring up initially is important. It's somewhat related to geography. What are the tax structures for that state and that county where you're investing in?
Sure.
And does that taxing entity have some sort of predictable formula for investors? So, like, for example, we're predominantly, everybody knows, we're heavily invested in Indiana. And we know that there is a 2% cap for non-resident owners of properties here in the state of Indiana. So what that means is that whatever the assessed value is, the most that tax is going to be every year is 2% of that assessed value. So the neat thing about that is, at least where we are here, we're not going to see any surprises. Now, obviously we speak to investors all over the country, all over the world, and we do hear all kinds of stories of other taxing entities where there are surprises that come up. So, the lesson here is not just how much taxes are, but what does that structure look like? And do I have a predictable structure with this taxing entity that I'm about to invest in moving forward for the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Sure.
And I think those are worthy considerations.
Absolutely.
Moving on, let's talk about insurance. And there's, a lot of different schools of thought here. But I know, Jack, you've got some opinions on, whether to insure, how much to insure for. But from a standpoint of the perspective of this particular podcast in just analyzing a property, what would you recommend to investors as far as analyzing insurance costs?
Well, take a look at, we can take a good example here of, coverage for acts of God/nature, right? So look at Florida, and I can guarantee you everybody in Florida, or a big chunk of Florida, is about to see a premium increase on their insurance rates when a hurricane rolls through, right? So when you're in areas where you're more susceptible to, catastrophic events, that is something that you got to look at, that, hey, look, my insurance rates could definitely go up, and they could go up, in a hurry, and they could even double. So putting yourself and investing into that, those types of markets, hey, you know what? There's people that do that and they can do very well. You just got to be careful and understanding the risks that go in, and making sure that you have enough cash flow to protect yourself should the insurance rates go up, that you're not going to be put into a negative cash flow situation. Those are the times that's the worst situation for an investor and that makes it hard to then sell the property, especially if an investment property, if you're not showing a monthly, positive yield, right? Like, who's going to buy it when it's not making any money, right? Unless somehow, some way, somebody else is convinced that the property, they can turn it around, or they can, force appreciation or do some magic or whatever, or they see something going on in the market, right? But overall, that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. So I definitely, for me, I self-insure a lot of properties. Obviously, the ones that I have long-term holds where I have financing attached to them, according to the lender, I have to have insurance on those, which probably is a good thing. So I just don't like paying for insurance when I have enough capital to self-insure a property and I'm okay with the risk. But the thing that people got to understand is what risk tolerance do you have? So if you get a higher deductible on that property, then, you're basically just saying, look, I'm okay with most of the things that happen to this property, and I'll pay for them out of pocket. And for that, I want a lower deductible and take on a little bit more risk. So it's all about risk tolerance as an investor. If you don't have much risk tolerance and you really don't have a whole lot of, cash readily available to deploy to, make any type of repairs should they come up, I'd suggest a low deductible and just pay more in insurance. So it just kind of depends.
And on that spectrum, obviously you can go all the way from self-insured all the way to, what you would call full replacement value insurance with a low deductible, where you're really protected. And I think when I look at the majority of what we do and our investors, and myself included, we're typically going for not replacement costs. We're just going for, approximately what we paid for the property and a fairly high deductible. Right, because obviously it's rare the chance that we're going to see any big things happen, but we just want to be covered in case they do. Now, We went into, as you remember, this amazing, great conversation with Mon Fung, who is a great guy here in Indianapolis, and he happens to own the Brightway agency. But we did a whole episode just on the nuances of insurance. I think it was episode 14. So if you're listening to this and want further information about all that stuff, go back and check out that podcast, because you'll really get some great insights about insuring your properties. That said, one of the biggest ones, and ones that we talk about a lot, of course, is property management.
Yeah.
And we could, I know we're going to do probably 2 or 3 more full podcasts just on property management, but from the sake of the analysis, when somebody's going to analyze a property, what are the things that they should be looking at with the property management that's either in place, A, or B, being suggested?
Well, this one's right up there with price in my book, Shecky, because you're investing in a property and you get a great deal, that's great. But the property manager is going to cause those rent checks to hit your mailbox/bank account every single month.
Yep.
So property management is pretty huge. I mean, that's why you and I spent, days vetting and interviewing different property managers. So we could set up our clients to be in the best position possible to cash flow and make money.
Yes.
And, at the end of the day, everything comes down to you get what you pay for. So, we have a couple different property managers we can refer people to, right? One where they're like virtually zero to very low lease up fee, and one where it's, first month's rent. And the difference in communication, between the two is it's off the charts, right?
Yeah.
So with the one where you're paying the first month, rent in full, you're getting instantaneous responses, and you're getting, a video walkthrough with your tenant, new tenant, going through the property, showing all the, what the property condition looks like, so that when they exit, we know exactly what damages that they did, if any. And therefore we can, have a case to keep security deposits or even garnish wages and whatnot. So
interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but interestingly, what happens nearly every time is when you look at long-term, the more expensive, more hands-on property management always ends up costing you less money long-term, because your property is being protected, and you have eyes and ears and people taking care of it correctly and putting the right tenants in and all that other kind of stuff. And, you said a mouthful when you talked about, getting what you pay for. I liken it. Here's a really, really good analogy. You're a parent. You have a busy business. You have an 8-year-old little girl, right? And unfortunately, you've got to work like 80-hour weeks for the next 4 or 5 years. So you've got to hire a nanny / babysitter. Now, this girl's your only child, like she's everything to you. And you want to make sure she turns out just to be the most amazing human being. So you can hire some, high school kid to come babysit your girl for, $7 or $8 an hour, or you can hire a true nanny that understands guidance and teaching and, molding young individuals to be excellent young adults. Now, the nanny teacher is someone that costs twice as much, and they require probably room and board and all kinds of other things. But given that this is a protective measure for your own child, what's the better choice for you? Like, do you want her just hanging around with some pimply-faced high school kid because you got that girl cheap? Or do you want your child to have true, good guidance and be well protected and be well nourished and grown correctly? And, I know that's a bit of a strong analogy, but you have to look at those investment properties that you have as, how are you protecting them? How are you nurturing them? What's the level of communication that's going on between the eyes and ears that are watching that for you and yourself? And so I think I agree with you. Property management might even be more important than price. It is that crucial to your investment performing. Yeah. So yes, those are questions you need to ask. Yes, you need to review the contract, but you need to see what kind of transparency and what kind of communication that property management does for you. And that's just one of those things that's beyond the numbers. It just requires asking some good questions, and that's it. So, and
I think, it definitely depends on the investor and their kind of like their threshold of, tolerance on, communication. I know I got some where this one gal, I guess I would call her high maintenance. I was going to say I would definitely call her high maintenance. And she's like, Jack, I'll pay more to get some more communication from my property manager. Like, I'll pay them more. Yeah. I'm like, it doesn't matter. They're not going to give it to you if you pay more. So let's put you in with a property manager that more fits what your threshold of tolerance is on communication. So it's, it is kind of got to match up with kind of your style. Like you've really got to know, like, if you don't really care about anything that's going on, and you just want to let the property manager do their thing, and whether it's leased up, if it goes vacant, whatever, you don't care, and then you want to pay less, great. So, it really does, that is something to definitely keep in mind. And when you're doing your due diligence, like really having a conversation with the property manager. I think that's important before you sign a property manager agreement.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a good segue because obviously having that visibility, having that transparency, having that communication obviously correlates directly towards future repairs, capital expenditures, right? I mean, that's kind of what they're watching for you. So that's obviously another really, really important metric. So that said, what are you suggesting? I know that, we kind of both agree that we should be putting money away every month, as a percentage of rent for the future repairs. What is your suggestion regarding that? Like, what do you think the percentage should be for CapEx put away as a percentage of rent?
Well, I think at least 5%, Shecky. If you want to be ultra conservative, and hyper conservative, go to 10%. I think, part of that does depend on, what condition you buy the property in. If you buy the property where, there's a lot of deferred maintenance has been deferred, then you can, definitely want to chart, a higher percentage on there. If you're getting a freshly rehab property where, everything was, done bulletproof, and, you got new roof, or, roof has been checked, it's good for another 10 years. You got, new mechanicals, electrical, plumbing, it's all been either newer, replaced, or checked out to last for a long time. If you got all those major CapEx items, scouted out properly, then you can, probably be more conservative on the, I should say more conservative. You can be more aggressive and put a lower amount, for that particular item. So it does depend on, I think the biggest thing is depending on the condition of the property and the property management, because the property manager is going to have a large effect on what kind of, costs that you're going to incur to get things fixed. If they're charging you, that's where they're making their money, is by charging you, double what it actually costs. Well, then that could definitely increase that percentage quite a bit. So, if they're doing this, like we talk about the video walkthrough with the new tenant to try to protect you on the exit of that particular tenant, then that could save you a ton of money on repairs, because then you could put all those on the tenant, so right. It does, there are some factors and variables there that you got to think about.
Yeah, and I think that, you bring up a good point at the beginning of this, is really just understanding the condition of the property as you're going in, as you're doing your entry into the purchase of that property. So, because that's going to give you a pretty good indication of future repairs. So some of that boils down to trust, right? Like, if you're not trusting who you're buying from, then definitely get an inspection, right? But, like in our world, we provide to our investors a full scope of repairs. We show them exactly all the stuff we did or we're about to do. And we also warrant everything we do. So we give everybody that buys a property from us a full, we call it roof to foundation. You can call it bumper to bumper warranty, whatever you want to call it. But we know that we've done a good enough job, not just on the repairs, but on the assessment of present condition. Even if a certain item didn't need repairs, we know we've got a lot of confidence in our processes that we can say, you are not going to have any expenses for the first year. And we are so confident about that, that if you do, we'll pick up the cost of those. And as you know, Jack, we rarely make a mistake there and rarely have to pick up any additional expenses to honor that warranty. And as a result, we have a lot of investors where we've built a lot of trust with them, and many of them buy sight unseen, and many of them buy without inspection, because they are, obviously having that warranty and having a really, really good detailed scope of repairs is certainly more than evidence enough that they can see what needs to be done, what has been done, and all that kind of stuff. But it does go back to speaking to knowing the condition of the property. And that affects other things too. Obviously, a property that's in good condition is going to rent up easier too. And that's a really good segue into the next metric that we should be looking at. And that's the one that I feel like gets really played around with a lot because it's hard to always know, and that's your vacancy adjustment. So, you can talk about rent rates, vacancy rates, all that other kind of stuff, and throw all kinds of statistics out there, but rarely are they exact, and rarely do they match up what is happening in the real world, and always they affect the ROI. So, I'm just kind of curious as to what your thoughts are in regards to assessing a good vacancy adjustment, and what should investors be putting away and considering as a fair number there.
Shecky, there's one thing I really want to revisit, and then we're going to jump to this on the future repairs. It just hit me like a ton of bricks as we're talking about this is, if you're buying from somebody that is a little bit unscrupulous, I'm just thinking about from my perspective, it would be so easy for me to, and there's 4 properties I'm thinking of in particular, to sell those with broken sewer lines. If I wasn't on the up and up, I could easily pass those off to another investor and they never catch it. And on the inspection, inspectors aren't going in and, scoping and putting a camera through the, sewage line. There's 4 I'm thinking of, Shecky, that we could have sold to investors and not taken care of that. And, we actually had a couple investors where, we found out after the sale was done and finalized, I don't own the property anymore. The investor does. And I'm going back in and we're going to fix that sewer line for them. And that's not, when you're digging down and repairing a sewage line, Shecky, that is not a cheap fix. So
no, it's not.
Yeah.
It speaks to the warranty, and it speaks to being, us being men of our words and doing what we say we're going to do.
Yes. So trust, like you said, trust of who you're buying from is very, very important. And I think I just wanted to really nail that point that you made with, a real life example. Because the first property I bought in Indianapolis came with a broken sewer line, and, it's under the street. I'm looking at a monster bill to try to, it's going to kill probably 2 years worth of cash flow to fix it. So, and that was my, obviously I take 100% responsibility. Don't blame anybody. I didn't know what I didn't know. And, I obviously wasn't doing business with somebody trustworthy. So therefore, I'm going to pay the price of that, but I'm not going to pass that on to other people. I'm going to learn that lesson and make sure that new investors are protected. So
yeah, I agree. And even if you wanted to, I wouldn't let you.
right. So
you go.
Yeah. So let's vacancy adjustment.
Just dialing back to vacancy is what I was asking you is, what do you think is the right metric to be looking at, depending on the kind of property it is?
Yeah. I mean, it does. It definitely depends on the property, Shecky. I'm not going to throw out a number on this because there's so many variables. If you're looking at a single family property, I mean, and depending on, the area that you're buying in and how hard the tenants were screened, which again goes back to property management. We have a property manager that has a 4%, average on single families, right? Over, a 5-year period. So his average, when he places a tenant, his average tenant will stay 4 years. That's really low vacancy percent,
right? Stellar. That's not pretty good. That is
stellar. Then we start to move into multifamily. If we get up to a duplex, we're going to experience more transients. The tenants are going to stay 1 to 2 years. And there's exceptions to that, right? If you can get a family parked next to each other and that works out, they could stay for years because they're right next door to each other. Or they may stay for 3 months because they figure out that there's a family feud and they all blow up on each other, right? So the larger, then we start to get to quads, and now we're total, absolute, no predictability on vacancy rates. We could be 30%, 40%, probably on a really bad type of situation. But typically on a quads, what I see is 25%, vacancy rate. You're gonna always have one that's vacant at all times. So you've got to factor that in. So then your, price to rent ratio needs to be higher on those to make up for the vacancy loss. And so what we found is, we love the quads, a couple of years ago, they looked great on paper. I mean, fabulous on paper. And then they turned out when they actually, rubber meets the road, they start performing, you start to see over a longer period of time the transient nature. So we tend to steer newer investors away from the quads and let more experienced investors that can tolerate the risk and the transient nature of those to take on those type of properties. So it depends totally, right, on what type of property and tenant class and all of that.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point in that an investor can be easily deluded by multis, by looking at like, okay, this thing's got 2 roofs instead of 1, or 4 roofs instead of 1, or 8 roofs instead of 1. And they start getting dollar signs in their eyes. And rarely does that situation flesh out in real life the way they had, quote unquote, analyzed it. So, like, for example, you kind of alluded to it, Jack. It's rare that we will even put up a fourplex even on our site anymore. And, for the most part, we're just dealing with singles and duplexes.
Yeah.
And you look at our, what we call a CFO, which is our cash flow opportunity. It's a little 1-page pro forma on our site. You will see that obviously with some variance for property class, which we're going to talk about in a minute and all that, but the duplexes, we will always put a higher vacancy rate, a higher turnover rate on those CFOs than we will on a single family property. Only because we know from experience, from real world experience, that we are going to have more stabilities in the singles. And it's just the way it is. So don't be deluded into something that may look super amazing on paper. You sometimes have to go beyond the numbers and look at what the real world situation is.
Yeah,
So,
I'm a big fan of Grant Cardone. I love his, aggressive nature. Go out, make more sales, increase your income, grow your business, get out of the middle class. I love, and he's huge on real estate and growing a business and investing into real estate and passive income. And he's so hyper strong on multifamily. And so when I first started, investing, I was, I wouldn't say brainwashed me, but kinda. And so I would only buy multifamily. And I was almost like not against the singles, but like, nah, those aren't strong enough on the ROI. Well, then as I start to learn and see things trends over time, the singles are amazing investments. They're so stable. The vacancy rates are low. There's such high demand. I mean, as soon as they go vacant, it feels like they rent up almost immediately or within a very short period of time. So yes, when you have a single family and it goes vacant, you lose 100% of your income on that property, right? But the time that it's actually vacant is usually very, very low. So on multifamily, they have, if you have 2 units, 4 units, whatever, and you lose a tenant, you still have income on that property, but the time that it can be vacant is longer just due to, tenant demand. They want their own yard, 4 walls, all of that. So just kind of wanted to throw that in there as well as far as vacancy goes.
Yeah, and the next one is property class, and this one has probably got the needle that moves the most because it's just so dang subjective, right? So, in the investment world, we basically use A, B, C, and D for investment class of properties. And I mean, Jack, if you don't mind, I'll just give you my description. Again, just my opinion, what I think an A, B, and C, and D are. Okay, and then we could argue this all day long, but at least in Indianapolis, where the majority of our investments are, I would say an A is, the real high line, pretty stuff downtown, beautiful house out in the suburbs with finely manicured lawns. That's what I would call an A. I mean, these are, if somebody was going to rent it, they're, definitely white collar business owner, plenty of disposable income, things like that. That's what I would call an A property.
Sure.
A B property is still got a lot of stability. It's probably older suburbs, so it's maybe a little bit closer to the city, just, like an established middle class suburb, close to an interstate, that sort of thing. You got all your Walmarts and Targets and all that other thing nearby. You're probably not living right on a lake or anything like that, but you still got, reasonable crime, good stability. Probably, at least in this area, a lot of the homes that were built in, say 1940s, 50s, and 60s, maybe into the 70s. And that's what I would call a B class. These are people that, for the most part, the renters could be white or blue collar, but they still have a lot of stability. Then you get into C class, which is a little bit more inner city, probably slightly higher crime rates just because they are a little bit more inner city. There's, for the most part, service workers, like waiters, waitresses, bartenders, things like that, blue collar workers, UPS drivers, things like that, that are more of your rental base. They're just typically solid, hardworking Americans, but they're the kinds of people that will probably never own a property because they're not going to generate any real income or any real savings. Some of that is their own habits. Some of that is just, because of the way that they were raised and just, natural economic conditions. That's what I would call a C class. The D class is what we see in Indy may have used to have been D class, which is now C class, but at one time, these were pretty rough areas. A lot of sport up, quite a bit of crime, what investors affectionately would call war zones, which I would call D class. And there, obviously, in those areas, the numbers can always look good because you can buy cheap, but you also have a lot of instability in those areas, and that instability can really make those not such good deals. So, from a standpoint overall, like what our strategy is and what we recommend to our investors is we are heavily invested in C-class properties because that's where we get the best pricing and the best price to rent ratios. But with a big asterisk, those only work when you have really good property management. And when I say really good, I mean firm but fair. That's really where our sweet spot is. And we do pepper it in with some B class too, just to be out there. But we really are never in any A's and we're never in any D's. The A's are the real hoity-toity high maintenance types. And, if you got an ant crawling across the floor, then they're suing you and they want you to do pest control remediation, and they're just too expensive.
You're not exaggerating at all, right?
Well, no, but I'm saying it's probably an over-exaggerated analogy, but it's
right.
That type of renter that just has these incredibly high expectations, and the cost of maintaining those expectations is very, very high. So, this is why we do a little bit of B and a lot of C. So anyway, that's my description. You can agree or disagree, but I feel like when somebody is analyzing a property, whatever your subjective method is for determining A, B, C, or D, think back to what I just described to you, and whatever letter you give it, it doesn't matter. Can you be in a situation where you're investing correctly based on those descriptions?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed them, and I totally agree with everything you just said about the different, classes. And yes, it is very subjective. I mean, we could definitely argue, some people might call something a B, we'll say it's a C, or vice versa, and we might call it a C, they're going to call it a D. Generally speaking, though, I mean, those that know our market, we typically see that we all kind of agree, like, our rehab and acquisitions guy, Antonio, our property manager, or, wholesalers, I'll ask them all independently of each other. And typically they're very close in terms of how they would rate a property. So it's just, but they've all been in the market for 30 years and 20 years, 30 years, they understand the market. And they start to kind of like align with where they are at. So let's talk about crime rates, Shecky. Like, why don't we just go on, what is that, Trulia or whatever, and we'll look at crime rates, and that'll help us determine whether we should buy a property or not. If there's a red line, that means stop. If a green line, that means go.
Yeah, I almost wish this wasn't a podcast and the people listening could see me shaking my head right now.
Right.
This is one of these areas where we get into it with investors where many people just don't get it. So, you can go onto a Trulia or a Zillow or some of these municipal sites, and they're going to give you these pretty little color-coded maps to show you, what sort of the general crime rate is in that vicinity, right? They'll show you what the general quality of the schools are, as if to say this is going to determine the quality of life, right? Well, the fact of the matter is there are real human beings living and working and loving and dying and shopping and educating in these areas, just like every other area. And they have very similar wants and desires to every other human being on the planet. And I don't think that when you look at a map that's covering, say, a 5 square mile area, that it really tells you what's going on in the 1800 block of Prospect. It just doesn't tell you. It just doesn't give you any real indication of what's going on that street. It's almost like that same argument we talked about with the appraisals and the assessments earlier. It's just an average of what's going on in a very, very large area.
Right.
And I find that the crime maps and the school rating maps to be even less consistent than appraisers, if you can imagine that, right? Like it's just, they're just not consistent. Right. Will it give you some kind of blanket indication? Yes, it absolutely will. Will it tell you that, that the 1800 block of Prospect is a good street? No, it won't. And that's why you have a couple of choices at this point. If you really want to see what's going on, then either A, get your butt over to the property that you're looking at and drive the few streets around it and drive up and down that street, or do what I did and ride my bike where you really get the feel of it. Or B, if you're investing long distance with a company like ours, again, it's a big word, but it's based on trust. And so one of the reasons that turnkey companies like ours do well and maybe other turnkey companies don't do as well is because they are the eyes and ears and the trust factor for that investor. And so you just have to decide, like, do these people really know what they're talking about? Am I trusting them with the decision of where they're buying, where they're promoting, things like that, and where they're selling to me, right? So again, we've talked to people, as you know, that like we just had a couple that drove up, they took a 6-hour drive from where they live to get here. And I encouraged it. Yes, come on down. Let's go look at stuff, right? And it proved to be a very fruitful trip for them because they could really see our processes and what we're doing, and they could really, get kind of a boots on the ground effect. I mean, obviously, if you're 18 hours drive away, that gets a little bit more difficult. But what I would say is ask the right questions. Ask what's going on that street. Let's learn what the city is doing in that 4 or 5 block area. What are they doing what other gentrification is going on? What other activity with other rehabbers is going on? That sort of thing. Rather than just looking at, well, let's look at 10 square miles of a crime map. It just, unfortunately, it's one of those metrics that I feel that investors are placing too much stock in. And unfortunately, it may keep them from buying a property that they just could have made a buttload of money on.
Sure. And
they got scared off because they saw that green was a little bit darker there, or the school was a 6 out of a 10 instead of an 8 out of 10, And okay, well, it's going to just cost you a bunch of money. So
yeah, you're going to pay more for, a property that is going to be in a different area with a great school. And in all likelihood, if you know the area, you got boots on the ground analyzing the areas for you, then they're going to put you in a position where you're going to make money and get ROI and cash flow. It's Antonio who does all of our, scopes and analyzes a property, tells us what kind of class it is. He's lived there for 40 years. He said, pretty much know in every neighborhood, I know somebody that lives there. So I know what type of class of people are in that area. Because I was asking, like, how do you know whether there's a B or a C? You're so good. Like, a C plus, C minus, D's. He said, yeah, because I know this area. I've lived here, all these streets I grew up on. So that's what we're able to provide to our investors is a street by street, almost analysis of whether you want to stay away. And if we're not buying something that we're not going to put our investors into a risky situation because we got to ultimately answer to you. So yeah, it's good to have boots on the ground, Shecky, that you can, like you said, that you can trust.
And dialing back to something we said earlier, I want to give Antonio a shout out because if you're wondering how we do go and assess all these properties, go back and listen to podcast number 10. I think if there's some like the word "no surprises" in the title, but it's a really good indication of how you can be assured that your property is going to be in the right condition and how we assess it. So let's move on. Let's, the number that gets argued about the most, or the one that's the most obvious, Jack, is ROI. It's a, return on investment. It's an indication of how that property is going to cash flow. So what are your thoughts as far as, what's a good ROI? What should people be looking for?
Well, I just listened to a podcast today where a guy that had been very, very successful over many, many years in investing said that, look, if you're getting 15%, ROI, then you have got to know that there is a lot of risk that you're not seeing in that type of investment, that there's a lot of risk that you are seeing and probably a lot that you really aren't. And I thought about that. I'm like, wow, we deliver 10 to 15%, sometimes better than that, Shecky. If we get a duplex or a quad that really, performs really well, or single with zero vacancy, there are situations where we can put people above 15%. But we're hitting those numbers, and I've got lots of investors that, I come back to them after a year, 2 years, some of them, they're hitting that pretty consistently. So I thought to myself, wow, we're doing pretty darn good. It's pretty high returns. When you're north of 10%, you're doing really, really well. And doing that, if you're doing that consistently and predictably, plus all the tax advantages. So I do, as we've talked many times before, Shecky, I love ROI. I mean, that's really the only thing that really matters to me. At the end of the day, I want to deploy my capital, and I want to know that I'm going to get a predictable and relatively safe return. Now, there are things that go wrong on a property. You guys, as investors, you got to know that and be aware of that. It's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows over the course of multiple years. Come on, things can go wrong, okay? And you have to account for that. So at the end of the day, though, if you're buying with all these things in mind that we just went through, price, to rent ratio, getting in at the right price, CapEx items considered, lower taxes, lower insurance. If you're looking at all of that, then at the end of the day, if you have one of the two variables that we can't control, right, vacancy rates and, the CapEx or maintenance items, if those go further north of what you're projecting and expecting for a given year, you still have enough cash flow margins coming in to protect yourself so you don't go into a negative cash flow situation. And I just, it's comical to me, Shecky, how many, especially it's more my newer investors are, well, I didn't make 15%. I didn't make 15%. I only made 10%. I'm like, you're serious. You got to be kidding me right now. You're getting 10% returns and you have very little margin of risk variance compared to what you would in the stock market. Go put your money in the stock market right now at an all-time high and then talk to me in 24 months and let's see how sorry you are for having made that decision. So,
and you own real property.
You own real property.
And you own a tax deduction.
Exactly.
I mean, it's there's all kinds of things. I want to throw one other little thing that I actually forgot to put on our list of talking points, and it kind of goes back to the tax situation, but I think it needs an honorable mention, and that is one of the things that you should also be looking at in regards to location is what are the laws like in terms of favorability towards landlords or tenants?
Oh, yeah.
Because that could affect your returns. And again, it's not something that I think you should overanalyze, but you just got to ask yourself a question like, okay, if for whatever reason the relationship sours with a tenant, they're not paying whatever, and I need to get rid of them, do the laws favor me from a standpoint of being a landlord? Can I protect my investment? Can I get them out quickly and inexpensively? A really good example for us geographically speaking is we're in Indiana, and the neighboring state, of course, is Illinois. And in Illinois, the landlord-tenant laws, whatever you'd call those, are vastly different in Illinois than what they are to Indiana. And as a result, we do have a lot of investors, especially from the Chicago area, that look to invest here in Indianapolis, where it's only a 3-hour drive, and but the numbers, not just the pricing and rents are different, but the laws are different. So, if you get into a situation where you want to get rid of somebody, it's pretty easy to do that. So again, it's just something to put on your list as an investor, depending on which state you want to invest in. That's a question worth asking and learning what those laws are like. And, can you answer the question, hey, can I get a renter out easily, quickly, and inexpensively if I need to? If the answer is no, you may want to be rethinking about investing in that state, because a squatter, if they can sit on your property for 6 or 8 or 10 months, man, that could cost you a lot of money.
I haven't verified this, Shecky, but from what I've heard, in Chicago, if tenant stops paying in the winter, you cannot evict them in the winter months. That is pretty rough. People know the law, so then they take advantage of that. And they just stop paying, like, okay, I've got this free rent for the next, 5 months. They, by law, can't remove me. So there are definitely got to look at that type of stuff. New York, I've heard it takes like 6 months to get somebody out. There's other states like that, around the country. Just be careful and do that due diligence and understand, what you're getting into. If you do run into a situation where tenant stops paying, how long will it take you to get them out so you can reestablish your cash flow? So let's wrap up with the timing of the decision, Shecky. How long should they evaluate, a property? How long should they evaluate an area of real estate? I mean, what is this goes back to our title, right? Analysis paralysis.
Honestly, I feel really strongly about this one because I see this go on all the time. There are so many investors that are so busy analyzing everything that they do have analysis paralysis. They're too paralyzed, and they're using that as an excuse to not make a decision. And there is a huge, huge cost to that. So to answer your question, how long should you take to evaluate a property? Here's the answer. You can quote me on this. I'm sure that you will agree with this. Only long enough to get a feel for the metrics that we just discussed. If you can gather all that information that we just talked about in 2 hours, that's all you need. You do not need 2 months. You do not need 6 months. And I'm going to give you an example how much this can cost you during this period of analysis. I'm going to use one of our typical properties just to frame this correctly, right? So this analysis paralysis is, very common with investors. But here's the irony. While they're analyzing these properties, their cash is not being deployed, right? So the cash is not working. They're losing money by sitting on the sidelines. So here's an example, right? For this example, it's very common for us to sell a nice duplex, let's say 2 or 3 bedrooms on each side and 1 bath. That's pretty common type of property for us for, say, low to mid 60s. I'm going to use $62,000 for the sake of this example. Cash flow typically would be $650 rent aside, so gross rents of $1,300 a month. So waiting 6 months while you are analyzing is costing you $7,800 in gross cash flow. Let's just say conservatively, after we take out for future CapEx, vacancy rates, taxes, insurance, everything like that, I calculated that at about $6,300. Now, we are also living in a time of inflation. We know we've got about 2% inflation a year, so half a year gives us 1%. When you add all of that in, right, and you talk about another approximately $1,500 depreciation that you would take on that property in this year, overall, that 6 months costed you $8,420 by not making a decision during that 6 month period. And what you've been doing during that entire 6 months is trying to figure out how to save $2,000 or how to better that deal by $2,000 while you've lost $8,420. So I know I'm speaking somewhat passionately right now, and people will disagree with this, whatever. It's like, no, I got to make sure my numbers are right. But I'm just telling you, and you're listening to this podcast, analysis paralysis is costing you big time. And the better the deal is, that higher ROI, you talked about 10%, that's costing you some money. If you're thinking about a 15% deal and not doing it, that's costing you even more money, right? So it's just, I cannot stress this point enough. The amount of time it should take you to analyze a deal as however long it takes you to go through the 7 or 8 factors that we just discussed. That's it. And once you get good at this stuff, you can do that in an hour or two. It's not that hard to do. It's just a matter of forming some good habits and going through it.
Yeah. I'm probably a type of investor that could have spent a little bit more time, in the analyzation process. Like I'm very aggressive. I'd like to make decisions quickly. And so been a few times where I'm like, I wish I would have maybe done a little bit more research, analyzed that one a little bit better. End of the day, I've always been able to, once I bought them, I've always been able to make them work eventually. Like any property that I have, I can get them to performing. I just had more repairs or whatnot, probably paid too much for the property and had more repairs than what I had anticipated. So if you can knock those two out, out by doing your analyzation, knowing you're not paying too much and knowing that there's not a lot of unforeseen repairs that you're going to be looking at that you didn't factor into your ROI calculations, then I think, at the end of the day, Shecky, don't analyze everything to death. Just get your cash deployed and let's go. Especially if you're busy and you're a professional and you're making pretty good money at your career, time is money. Time is money. Yeah. So not only is it the time, you're talking about, the lost capital being deployed, but also all that extra time that you spent distracted from your main source of income, distracted from your family, distracted from all the other things you enjoy doing in life. There's an additional cost there as well. So, not telling you guys rush in, just make a decision and jump in without really knowing what you're getting into. We don't want to go to that extreme, but there's a happy medium in there, right, Shecky? Right, I'm trying to kind of say somewhere right in the middle there. Let's go and let's get things going.
Yeah, absolutely.
So so this is one of our lengthier podcasts, but I think it's pretty valuable, Shecky. A lot of ground that we've covered, and hopefully we've given the investors a lot of things to look at and give them the tools they need to properly analyze a deal. Whether they do deals with us or go out and analyze deals on their own and buy from other, markets, companies, whatever, if we're helping you guys out and providing value to you to help you increase your buy and hold knowledge and increase your cash flows and ROIs, great. That's what we want to do. And what goes around comes around. We'll get our rewards down the line one way or another. So if you found value in this, please give us a 5-star review, whether it's iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you're picking up this podcast. We'd really appreciate that. That helps our rankings to help to get this information out to more people. And if you are interested in taking a look at some of our properties, we have buy and hold, turnkey real estate available. We're constantly getting new inventory in. So you can book a call with us and we can show you things that haven't even hit the website yet, or just go to highreturnrealestate.com and take a look at all of our information and some of our properties that we have posted right there. So Shecky, as always, been great. And thank you so much for all your, preparation and inspiration and due diligence on this particular podcast. Appreciate you, man. So with that, everybody have a great day.
Appreciate you too, brother. Thanks for being a great partner and for all of your insights. And I think what we should do is just put this list in the show notes on our site too, so that if people need a good reference point, back to the items that we really want to address quickly, if they can see that list, they could probably, review it and run back through it pretty quickly. And if that helps people make an easier and faster decision on analyzing a property, I think that'd be great.
Awesome.
So we'll make sure to do that too. So,
sounds great.
Anyway, thank you for listening. This has been great. And if you're listening to this, probably by the time we get it produced and out there, it's probably 2 weeks after Halloween. So hope you had a happy Halloween and that you got all the candy that you deserved.
Have a great day, everybody.